All right, welcome everyone. Want to remind you that we have a bar in the back. Feel free to get a drink if you like. I'd like to welcome Adrian Crenshaw, aka Iron Geek. For years, he's made a lot of contributions to the information security community with IronGeek.com. He is also one of the founders of DerbyCon that will be held this year. What dates for this year? 28?
Last weekend of September, but I don't remember the exact date off the top of my head.
It's the last weekend in September, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But the tickets are sold out.
And the tickets are sold out. There may be some training classes still available, possibly?
Training class is still available, and if you follow us on Twitter, you may, or watch for tweets about DerbyCon, you might see people selling tickets.
So yeah, we here at ShowMeCon really appreciate all the efforts of Adrian to get this online. So in case you miss a talk, or there's and every year we have that great problem of having two talks that are booked at the same time. So Adrian provides a great service by being able to catch those talks. But everyone, welcome Iron Geek.
Thank you much. All right. Oh, by the way, the first 3 talks from yesterday are up. Yeah, but the bandwidth here is a little slow, so maybe Wednesday before I get everything up. Anyway, you're here for the history of hashes talk, essentially. And we're going to be talking about password storage, password transmission to a degree, and the password of cracking these. Now, first a little bit about me. My name's Adrian Crenshaw, and I run IronGeek.com, but you already know that. I have an interest in InfoSec education. I don't know everything. I'm just a geek with time in my hands. I'm probably going to get a lot of stuff wrong in here. Actually, I had a few people review my paper I wrote for preparation for this talk and corrected a bunch of stuff, including Solar Designer, the guy who originally created John the Ripper. He went through and said, well, this is not quite right, that's not right, that's not right. So I'm going to try to correct things if I screw it up. But a lot of this history I pieced together through what I could read in old, use group postings. So it may have a few things wrong. And also about me, I'm a senior information security consultant for TrustedSec, one of our sponsors here, and a co-founder of DerbyCon. Okay, a few thank yous, first of all. There was a paper that I pulled out a lot of this information from 1978, and it was actually the inspiration for this talk. Password Security, a Case History by Robert Morris and Ken Thompson, published on April 3rd, 1978. The reason this is the inspiration for this talk is they talked about so many things in that article that if people had followed it, a lot of password mistakes over the last almost 40 years would not have been made. I usually think most academic articles are kind of navel-gazing BS, but that one is actually a really good one. It's now kind of a self-evident article since everybody knows it's a good idea if they know about security, but it's if people had followed it, a lot of the problems we have now wouldn't have been there. Also, Password Security, Past, Present, and Future is a talk that was done by Solar Designer and Simon Marshall. And if that had been recorded, I probably wouldn't need to do this talk. I'm going to be a little bit more Windows-focused than they were, but those slides are out there online. I highly recommend checking them out. And hopefully if they do the talk again sometime, they'll record it and put it up online, because they know a lot more about password hashes than I do, and a lot of the history that I don't know they were involved in. All right, password history. Reinvent the wheel. There's a few things I want you guys to take out of this talk. One, some people say InfoSec is always changing, and there's aspects of it that do change all the time. However, some mistakes are made again and again. People just keep making them even if they know it's a bad idea, or somebody knows it's a bad idea. They may not know it's a bad idea. And the way I like to put it is, software vulnerabilities generally get patched, but bad design decisions and recurring configuration mistakes are forever. Someone's always going to choose a bad password. Someone's always going to right-click and say share all and take all the defaults. Sometimes the defaults get better, but people are going to make these kind of mistakes forever and a day just because it's easy. Like FTP server, wide open. Why not? It works so good. And it's because, the first primary thing for most people is, well, got to get to work. Okay, it works. Does it work securely? That's a secondary consideration in most cases. And people keep making these same freaking mistakes. And I'm going to try to highlight that in some things that were, well, if they'd read that paper from 78 I mentioned, they would have made these mistakes. And if people did a little research into articles and the past, they might realize what they're doing on the current design decisions is wrong and will lead to security problems. All right, we're going to talk about ancient times and passwords just a little bit, because I was trying to find the earliest uses of passwords. And the best I can find is watchwords, where if you're a century, and someone's coming back from across enemy lines, you want to prove them to prove that they are one of your people, you have a watchword. You challenge them, if they give you the right word, you know that they're hopefully on your side. And Polybius wrote about these back in, well, somehow we're in the BCs. That was his lifespan. I'm not sure exactly when he wrote of them. In History's Book 6, Daily Orders and Watchwords. And he talked about how people would pass passwords, or watchwords down through the chaining, and how one little, I can't remember the technical terms for that particular type of, for the way they organize their armies, but like a platoon would talk to the next platoon, talk to the next platoon, and pass it on. And they have a certain person from each platoon that had to do that particular duty. Also, I thought about judges. And there was a case in point from judges where these the Gildites captured the fords of the Jordan, leading to Ephraim, and I'm probably totally butchering these names. And the survivors of Ephraim said, let me cross over. The Gileads asked them, say the word, are you an Ephraimite? If he replied no, then they said, all right, say the word Shibboleth. And based on how they said the word Shibboleth, if they couldn't pronounce it correctly, then they would, well, it wouldn't be a very good day for that particular person. So they used basically how someone said the word as proof of whether or not they were who they said they were. Now, going forward a little bit, Veneer cipher was a cipher system that essentially, well, it was like a variable Caesar. Instead of always incrementing by 13 and decrementing by 13, what they actually do is they take a letter, and let's say, I believe the system is something like this. Let's say the first letter of your password is A, like let's say Adrian, where you might increment all the letters in a sentence by 1. If it's B, you'd increment it by 2. And that way you can use a password and use a polyalphabetic substitution to make your stuff, to encrypt your message. And this was first designed, in fact, it's called Veneer cipher. A whole bunch of people have invented it throughout history. The earliest person people know about is Belleau in 1553. Now, the Confederates used a disk like this to speed up the process. I've also seen tables used, but you take the password and use that to encrypt and decrypt your message. Thinking back on the watchwords in Civil War, I don't have a whole lot of back history on some of my family, but there is one person in my family who has somewhat of his historical tie in the Civil War. He was one of the people who pulled Stonewall Jackson off the battlefield, supposedly, which sounds, oh, that's kind of a neat story, until you realize that Stonewall Jackson was shot by his own men. So my ancestors probably shot him. If they'd used better watchwords or yelled them louder, maybe that wouldn't have happened. Okay, a little later, used in bars during Prohibition to see whether or not someone was in the in-group. You want to know whether or not this person was a cop or not, or you keep it private that a certain word is what you have to say to get into that bar. This was shown in 1932, Marx Brothers movie called Swordfish. Oh, sorry, the movie not called Swordfish. They used the password Swordfish as the watchword to get into the speakeasy. And that's the reason that particular documentary that was Oh So Faithful back in the early 2000s came out. That's why it's called Swordfish. I really would need to work on my delivery on that one. Was that? Yeah, totally real. Almost as good as Black Hat. All right. Challenge response of a sort. World War II military use. They would use watchwords of a sort to see whether or not someone was the right person. So if someone challenged you with flash, you would return the word thunder so that they know that you are who you say you are. Paratroopers were also issued things that weren't watchwords, but let's say the challenge response was to use a little device that made clicking sounds to determine whether or not someone was who they said they were. Okay, now we actually go to modern times and computers, and this is where we get a lot more in the in-depth. Now, very early computers, they didn't have passwords. You didn't really need passwords so much because it was a big honking machine that was probably underneath armed guards in some kind of government or military facility. But the first machine that we know of to use passwords, or that people trace it back to, is MIT's compatible time-sharing system. And the cool thing about this system was, everybody could share use on it, and since everybody was using it at the same time, you got to be able to make it to where your stuff is separate from someone else's stuff, so you would put passwords on it. Now, the CTSS originally stored all its passwords in plain text, but not accessible to normal users. The passwords are stored offline to where if you're an admin, you'd be able to edit the file and see everybody's passwords, but each user, in theory, should not be able to. Now, obviously, this is a disclosure and accountability problems. Like, however you do backups, well, that password file is going to be there. Admins can see each other's passwords, so you have no real accountability there. Also, in 1962, Alan Shearer, he figured out how to get through the system. He was upset because of the amount of time he was given on the timeshare system. So his solution to get more time on CTSS was to take a punch card and use it to tell the system to automatically print out the password file for him. And then he just used everybody else's accounts for his time. And the reason I believe he was able to do this, if I understood what I read, is that process that was reading these punch cards and choosing what to print was essentially running, I guess, the equivalent of root or system. How many services back, well, 10 years ago especially, but even now, run a system or root when they don't need to? And this incident goes back to 1962. But that's a lesson to be learned from history. Also, in 1966, 2 users were editing both the quote of the day file and the password file at the same time. Because of how the editor made a little temp of the file, they got swapped. Now, quote of the day prints out as soon as you log in. So what ended up happening was the password file became the quote of the day, and everybody's like teletypers started printing out these passwords. They quickly shut down the system and reset it. I think it was like 5 o'clock on a Friday that this happened to them. So that admin had a bad weekend. Systems like that MIT system I just mentioned led to Multics. Now this is a lot like CTS, and it also went on to inspire Unix. Now Multics used a person name table for password storage, and it had a limit of 8-character passwords, which is a severe limit, and it's a limit that some software has had for a long time. Why 8 exactly was chosen, I do not know, but people carry that forward. And the limit, of course, well, any modern 8-character password is going to get broken. Options to encode. There were options apparently to encode the password, but I couldn't find a whole lot of information on them. Originally, they knew they didn't want to do like a plain text password file like the old MIT system had, and there were some suggestions about like squaring it or take the squaring of the files in binary, but you can take a square root of that, so that's just reversible. So you don't want to do that. So they found a different way of going about actually sort of encrypting it or making a hash, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The first system proved to be really insecure. It was later replaced by using the scramble function from the PLI language. I have yet to figure out how that worked. I'm looking for details on what that algorithm is. No one, nothing I searched for seemed to be able to tell me. But that one, I believe, also proved pretty weak by when the Air Force Tiger team tried to crack the system. Now, when Unix came about, early passwords were stored in plain text. So you had the same problem essentially as the old MIT system. However, it's a little worse since everybody can read the password file, assuming they stored them there at that particular time. There's a lot of little details that I can't find. Robin Morse developed the Crypt system based on an old M209 encrypting machine that the military used. I've also seen people attribute this to making basically an emulator of the Enigma, but apparently that one's not true. Some people quote that, but apparently it was the M209 that the early versions of Crypt were based on. And this appeared in version 3 of Unix. Now, Crypt was later used to store passwords in the 6th edition, 1974. So for quite a while there, to my knowledge, Unix was using plain text passwords in that password file. But even after they were encrypted, by default, for the longest time, passwords were still stored viewable by all in a hashed format. So you may not necessarily know the person's password, but you have its hash, and that would allow you to get the hash to try to crack the hash, which we'll talk about here in a bit. Shadowed password files, I'm trying to remember the first time they were invented. It was sometime in the early, it might have been 89. I think I have it later on in one of the slides. But even after shadowed password files were created, people still had the normal password system for quite a while thereafter. And once they applied the shadow password system, at least then the password hashers were in a file that every user couldn't just necessarily access. By the way, if you ever see crypt1 and crypt3, the utility referred to as crypt1 is supposed to be for encrypting files and such. The hash function is known as crypt3. Now, early versions of crypt3 used a 56-bit DES. They chose DES because DES was hard to reverse at the time and very slow at the time. Also, basically what the algorithm what they used was the first 8 characters of the password, 7 bits each. Because keep in mind, if you're talking about ASCII, straight up ASCII, not extended ASCII or anything, straight up ASCII is technically only 7 bits. So they take the first 7 bits, they do a little bit of work with it to make out, to essentially make a key, and along with a 12-bit salt, and this is used to encrypt a 0 block of 25 times. The result is then base 64 encoded and put into the file. And a rough description of doing this was listed in that 1978 paper I mentioned earlier. Crypt3 now supports a lot of other algorithms, but that is the classic 56-bit DES hash of old Unix systems. And what they did was, you might wonder, why didn't they just encrypt the password? Why did they use the password to encrypt something else? Well, where are you going to store the key? If you want to encrypt something like a password, you have to have the key somewhere. Since the system needs to know what the password is, or needs to be determined if you enter the right password, that key you encrypted the password would have to be on the system. And if it's on the system, then it can be recovered from the system. So why not use the password as the key to encrypt a known value? That's much, much harder to recover. And that's the way most, in one form or another, systems work. This idea apparently first came about in the work of Wilkes in a paper, I believe. I'm not sure if it's a paper or a book called Time-Sharing Computer Systems. And the other solution, of course, is to hash it. So you don't have to store the password. You're just storing the results of some mathematical operation on the password. But to give you examples of where just encrypting the password is a bad idea, I'll give you a few cases from history that show why it's a bad idea. One would be VNC. Used to be, at least, VNC would store its password in either the registry or file, and the key was known. You have the source code to VNC. So since you know the key, you can simply decrypt it. That's the problem of encrypting passwords. The system has to have the key to be able to read it. If the key is on the system, you can pull it back out. Another example would be gather group policy preference. Group policy preference. I'm not quite sure why I have that in the slide there. Microsoft had a way for you to, and still does, reset passwords on accounts inside a group policy. And they set it up so where you can encrypt the password so that people who are just pulling out GPOs, they can't see the password in plain text. However, eventually they published the AES key on their website for the way they were encrypting those passwords. So now, if you're on a pen test, one of the best things to do is grab the group policies, because everybody has access to that particular sys volume, pull them down, and then decrypt any password that you find that's using that key. There's a couple of ways of doing this. If you saw Ben 10's talk the other day, the functionality is built into PowerSploit, but there's also more manual ways of doing it. You could attach to a sys volume on one of the main controllers using SMB client, just pull all the files down, grep through them for C password, and use the GPP decrypt utility. You could also use a Metasploit. Metasploit has some modules for automatically doing it as well. Now, next question, what is a hash? I mentioned hash a little bit earlier. At its most essential, a hash is basically a mathematical formula to take a string and get a shorter number or string. There's few desired properties of a good cryptographic hash. One, pre-image resistance, or one-way function. Given a certain hash, it should be hard to find the plain text it is a hash of. The next quality you want is second pre-image resistance. With any given input, it should be hard to find a different input that hashes to the same value. And in this one, you're given the input. So you don't want to find another input that gives the same value. The other one, the final one, is collision resistance. It should be hard to find two different strings that hash to the same thing, both inputs chosen. There's a little, the second and the third sound kind of similar, but the difference is what information you're given. In one, you're just given the input, and you got to find something else to match. In the case of the last one, you just have to find any two matches. That's a case of, have you heard of the birthday attack? Like the probability of me having the same birthday as any one of you is fairly low, but the probability of some two of you sharing a birthday is a lot better because you have to think of all the possible combinations which you'd have to match for, and eventually you're going to find somebody, more than likely in a room this size, that has the same birthday. Or at least a decent probability of it. Alright, after Unix, we'll talk a little bit about VMS and VAX and how they did passwords. Now the initial version had a very, very bad hash. Essentially what it was autoed in to CRC32. So you all know about CRC32 for like checking for errors. This was designed for things like transmissions. And for transmissions, it's fine. You just want to know if some bits got flipped by static or spark or something. So it's fine for that, but it's not really good against premeditated tampering because you can modify files and make something match the same CRC2 hash. So let's take an example of a collision with CRC2. The word penetration, if you CRC32 it, you get the same value as if you tried to CRC32 perpetuity. You get the same hash value. So it's a really bad hash because it's easy to find another value that hashes to the same thing. And anybody who entered that password, it doesn't matter if they knew the actual right password, as long as they entered something that became that particular hash, it would let the person in. Now with version 2, in 1980, VMS began to use the Purdy polynomial-based algorithm, which my understanding is much more secure, but I don't know a whole lot about it. Now, to give you an example where someone screwed this up later on after someone else had previously screwed it up, VMS learned its lesson. However, in Outlook PST files, the way they store your password for the file is CRC32. So there's a program by Nearsoft that you can actually download that will, while it may not give you the original password for that PST file, it will generate a collision. You enter the collision as the password, and you can still get in. Here's a few example hashes for the plain text bad pass. The one we'll probably see used the most now, hopefully, would be, well, at least on Unix systems, is that SHA-2 512, and it's multiple iterations of that, and it's salted and so forth. There's a few examples of different password hashes. Improvements that can be made to password hashes, of course, or make them slower, and that's one of the reasons the original DES did, the original DES type crypt that was done on old Unix systems did it 25 times, was to make it a little slower. If you make it slower for people to run through the operation, well, if a user who's sitting there, it's probably not going to care so much if it takes 1 extra second to log in, but that's greatly going to slow down anybody trying to crack. That's the thing about more iterations. Another thing they can do is salt it. I mentioned salts a little bit. Salts are essentially something you add to the algorithm for making a hash that make it so that your password and my password, even though they're the same password, don't hash to the same thing if we don't have the same salt. The reason you salt things is to stop people from doing pre-computation attacks, which I'll talk a little bit more later. Windows did not do this. Oh, by the way, this was first talked about in that 78 paper I was talking about. Microsoft didn't apparently read this paper, but we'll get back to that in a second. The basic parts of a Unix hash are as follows. The first blue part, the 6 you see there, is the hash type. That one happens to represent SHA-512. I think the number of iterations of SHA-512 it does is like, I think it's 5,000 by default. I'm not sure, but that is configurable. I have an article version of this particular presentation that goes into more details. I'd recommend checking that one out, and you can find out exactly how it works. You see those other types, though, like MD5, which my understanding is not used much, Blowfish, NTLM, so on and so forth. This green part was the salt. Sorry. The green part is the salt, and all this is base 64 encoded, by the way. And this final part is the password hash. And this is for a SHA-512 hash off of a Unix system. Oh, sorry, well, specifically Linux. I pulled this one off of Backtrack 4 all1 a while back. Password security, a case history, that 1978 paper. Like I said, I don't think Microsoft actually read it because they made several different mistakes. Beginning at least with like Landman, that was designed by Microsoft, IBM, and Freecom. That was kind of the answer to Novell NetWare back in the day. Net Manager, I'm not sure when exactly. Oh, sorry. LAN Manager, I'm not exactly sure when this hashing algorithm they chose came about. I mean, I found when LAN Manager was invented, and it wasn't 1985, but I got the impression that maybe the algorithm for how they hashed it came out before, but it wasn't as early as 1985. I put that there because of Windows, but it's not. I think it's around, LAN Manager around 91 or so, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 89. And I'll talk about the algorithm in a bit. There's also NTLM, which came about in 1993, and version 2 of it, as far as the challenge response part, in 1998. Now, neither one of these types of hashes that Windows use are actually salted, and both are single iteration. LAN Manager was used in older Windows operating systems, let's say DOS-based ones, and on the LAN Manager system I mentioned before, which later on was replaced with NT. The basic algorithm for LAN-Man is to convert a password to all uppercase. So right there, you're already lowering the total key space you have to search through when you're trying to crack a password. They pad the plain text with null characters to make it at least 14 bytes. By the way, on most Windows systems, if it's longer than 14 bytes, I think in the older systems, what it would do is it would throw away characters, or maybe say you couldn't use it. On later systems, if you typed in more than 14 characters, it just didn't store an LM hash. It would then split this password into two 7-character chunks. And the reason they did this was because of the size of a DES key. But the problem with it is, it's easier to crack 2 7-character passwords than it is one 14-character password. And then what they would do, they would use this particular key, and by the way, that's not straight up the key in ASCII that they convert. They do a little bit of bit manipulation to actually make the key for DES encrypting. They DES encrypt this particular value, that KGS, exclamation mark, so on and so forth. Then they store that, after concatenating it back together, inside the password file. In this case, the SAM file for Windows. Now, NT Manager is at least a little bit better. They're using, at least they're using a cryptographic hash of a kind, well, definitely of a kind, but MD4 is since been considered not all that secure. So they take the Unicode mixed case password and use MD4 to maintain the hash. At least being Unicode, it allows a lot more character options. So it's a lot better there, even though most people are still only going to use upper and lowercase characters. They're not going to throw in, let's say, I'm trying to think of a good Unicode characters. Some of these strings have been crashing iPhones recently. You can, in theory, I suppose, use one of those. You can also, of course, use Alt and the numpad to be able to enter characters like the Omega symbol and so forth. But if you're going to mess with some pen testers, try putting the yen symbol in your password. It causes some serious problems. We figured it out, but it was a pain. It then stores this hash after doing the MD4 in the SAM file. But the problem with both LAN Manager, well, LAN Manager has a bunch of problems. But NTLM's problem is it doesn't salt it, and it also doesn't do multiple iterations. So it's really fast to crack. Not as fast as LAN-Man, but pretty bad. So why Microsoft decided not to salt things? No real idea, since Unix had been doing it for a bit by then. Now we're going to talk about password hash cracking and when that really started to take off. Those earlier versions of it, like that Tiger team I mentioned, hacking Multics, but it didn't really seem to take off in my mind until the 90s. That's when it became really popular. And this is a phrase I've heard referred to as Wright's Law, which I really like. It's named after Joshua Wright. And it's essentially security will not get better until tools for practical exploration of the attack surface are made available. What happened in the 90s? A whole lot more people got personal PCs. A whole lot more. I mean, they were around, but it became much more common because you started getting sub $1,000 PCs. People could play around with password cracking. Before then, if you only had time on like a university's computer, well, you probably didn't get a chance to play around. Another thing this has been attributed to, people didn't research a lot of things about Zigbee and Bluetooth until more devices came around that you could cheaply buy to play with those kind of things. Or NFC for that matter. By the way, this is not to be confused by someone else's rights law. Different one, I'm talking about the one for Joshua. So now, earlier types of password cracking, one example I can give you would be the Morse worm. You may remember the author I mentioned earlier, Robert Morse. Well, this is his son. He wrote a worm to experiment with replicating code, and on November 2nd, 1988, it started worming its way through the internet. And it had several different attack vectors for spreading, but one of the things it did was try to crack crypt-free passwords so it can get onto other systems and keep going. So it actually had a built-in password cracker back in '88 to do that. But there was earlier things happening too. Like, there was a password cracking competition that was apparently held, I would assume from this, in 1982. Sorry, yeah, 1982, since this one is 1983. And this was announced on Usenet. But like I said, I don't really think it started taking off big time until you had more people with PCs to play around with. And one of the earliest password crackers, as far as where people would just go, okay, I got a bunch of Unix passwords, let me start cracking them, was released by Dan Farmer in 1989 as part of his computer oracle and password system, a little tool called PWC. PWC inspired other people. The first public release of Crack 2.7a by Alex Moffat was based on PWC originally, but he did a complete rewrite by the time it was actually released in version 2.0. Well, it wasn't released by 2.0, it was released in 2.7, but by 2.0 he was basically a complete rewrite. And that came out on July 15th, 1991. So Cracker started becoming more and more, well, accessible to people. It had a few extra new features, such as a programmable dictionary generator, and also network distributed password cracking, so you can have more than one machine working on cracking your passwords. Later on, well, the early versions of Crack, as I understand it, were only on Unix. We want to open this up for other people who aren't running Unix. So Crackerjack for DOS and OS2 came out in 1993, I believe, by the Jackal. Then eventually, John the Ripper by Solar Designer came out in 1996. I think the initial release was for DOS. However, the source code was portable, and I think he may have even done some of the development on Linux systems. I'd have to go ask him to be sure. I may actually have that in the article. I don't recall how he said he did that at the time. But my understanding is the code was very portable, but the version they put out a binary for was DOS originally. It's supported on so many different systems now, and if I recall right, the first passwords it cracked were the old DES-type Unix passwords, but since been made to crack all sorts of hashes, especially if you use the jumbo patches. And it's still very much in use today. I mentioned the shadow file before. The shadow file is essentially a file that the password hashes were moved to out of the PASSWD file so that only root users could actually get to it. And by root users, I mean, well, never mind, I'll get to that maybe later. The first used, by the way, as far as I can know, in System 5, Release 33.2, back in 1988. But it didn't really take off immediately. Even into the late 90s, there were systems out there that weren't using the shadowed password. So you could dump the password file and at least try to crack the hashes, which I imagine a lot of people did at university systems. Not saying I did, but those people who did. Let's see. Windows cracking software. Oh, later on for Windows, there wasn't anything for cracking the hashes for a little bit, but in 1997, Jeremy Allison released the first version of pwdump, and this allowed you to quickly and easily, if you were the admin, dump all the password hashes out of memory. Shortly after that, NTCrack was released by Jonathan Wilkins, and you could actually try to crack those hashes you dumped with pwdump. A little bit after that, and this is the thing that really seemed to popularize password cracking, is loft, or at least for LM and NTLM hashes, is LoftCrack. If I recall correctly, Jonathan's tool only did LM hashes, and LoftCrack could do both NT and LM hashes. And that came out in 1997 as well, just a little bit later. And because of these tools coming out, Microsoft made a few changes. In Windows NT version 4 Service Pack 3, they introduced syskey. Now, syskey, though, still has its problems because usually the syskey is stored on the local system. So really, it only makes it a little bit more complicated to crack the passwords. You have an option with syskey to say save it to a disk, but no one ever does that to my knowledge. So all I did was make it, they added syskey to add an extra level of encryption on those hashes. So all I did was add one extra step. So instead of just grabbing the hashes from the SAM file, you had to grab the SAM and the system file, grab the syskey from the system file, and then dump all the hashes from the SAM file. These are the trifecta of Windows files you'd want to grab to do that. Well, that's the path they'd normally be in. You could have them someplace else, but SAM, system, and security. Security is for some other odds and ends, but for just cracking those passwords, SAM and system. And there's tons of ways to dump them, but you could pull the hard drive out. If you're an admin on a system, you could use something like modern versions of pwdump to dump them. You could boot from a USB or CD, or you could just rely on weak permissions. Let's say someone copied them someplace and you have access to them. On Kali Linux, there's several different steps, but you can quickly get to them and crack them, no problem, assuming they don't have full hard drive encryption. Also, Kane allows you to dump them. Besides using BK Hive, you could use Kane, either dump from memory or point at a SAM and system file, and be able to dump the hashes. Now, if you're curious about domains and where those are stored, that's in the ntds.dit file. And you can dump those either if, let's say you've exploited a domain controller, you can try using smart hash dump to dump those out, or create a shadow copy of the file, because you're not going to be able to copy the file out while it's still open, unless you make a shadow copy of it, then you can copy it and do your thing on it. And then you can use ntds extract to be able to actually extract those out and then crack those same passwords the same way you would a Windows client. And a quick way to crack those would be to use John, that was mentioned before. Use the RockU databases usually as for cracking the passwords. RockU, when that compromise happened, it was a great resource for pen testers because all those passwords are how do you put it? It shows you the way a user thinks. And a lot of users end up choosing passwords in that RockU list. And there's a few extra things on that particular command to mutilate the passwords, change them up to make it more likely that you'll be able to crack them. You'll do things like modify things, like let's say, turn an L into a 1 instead. Another type of Windows password is a PWL file. This is in old DOS-based ones. Now, they made a few bad mistakes on these. First of all, the first version only used 32-bit RC4. So it had it was fairly small key space to begin with. The file name is based on the username, so you quickly know what the username for that particular password file is. And there was a known plain text attack on it, because the first 20 characters are not random, but based on the uppercase username with null characters added. This causes a problem. Known plain text attacks are where, of course, you know part of the plain text of the thing that's encrypted. So this makes it easy to figure out the cipher stream with a quick XOR. And since they used the same RC4 cipher stream over and over again, it was easy to figure out the contents of, let's say, later parts of the file. This is I believe this was first looked into by, I'm trying to think of the gentleman's name, Peter Gutman. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, now this is not RC4, but I mentioned how if you are using a with RC4, assuming you're not doing any kind of initialization vectors, if you're encrypting the same thing with the same password again and again, the problem comes if you know the plain text for one part of it. What you can do is you can XOR the cipher text with the clear text and be able to get out the key. And to give you mathematically how this works, this isn't RC4 because instead of actually using an RC4 bit stream, I'm just using a password that I've converted to ASCII. But the XOR works similar. So let's say this is your text that you want to encrypt, this blue one. The way you would encrypt it is you'd XOR it with your RC4 stream, or in this case, the password in ASCII. just because it's easier to illustrate. And you get this red output. However, this red output, if you XOR it with the known plain text, you get out the key. So instantly, they start being able to decode the first 20 bytes of each of the records that were in there, and so you could pretty quickly find passwords. I think they later on did release a better version, and they went up to, I think, a 128-bit key, but to my knowledge, the plain text problem was still there. Oh, there's also things like stored credentials. At least Microsoft got a little better with this and learned some lessons, because at least the salted with the username. And in later versions, it got even better than that. But let's say the first version of the stored credentials, because you know how you can log into a system even if it doesn't have, a system is part of the domain and you can still log into it even if the network's off. That's because by default, Windows stores the last 10 logins on the system, so that if the domain controller is not reachable, you can still get in. Well, the original algorithm they did for this, they would take the Unicode password, concatenate it with the Unicode lowercase username, then MD4 it, the MD4 of the password, concatenate it with the Unix lowercase username, then MD4 that again. So it's kind of two iterations of MD4. That's a little better, and at least it's salted. With later versions of Windows, Vista and Forward, I believe, they used the MS Cache version 2 algorithm. This got a lot better because you were using a better hashing function in PBKDF2, and you were also doing multiple iterations, 10,240 if I'm not mistaken, of the original DC1 style hash. So at least they got better, but you can crack both of these. I believe John Jumbo supports both of them, and I think Kane may now as well. Other problems that cropped up over time. Back in the day, sniffers were not as common as they are now, so people didn't think about, well, on the wire, I should probably encrypt the passwords as I send them across. So back in 1969 and 1971, I mean, at the time, well, one, encrypting anything might have been prohibitive CPU-wise, and also, no one actually had sniffers, so why worry about it? Remember how I was mentioning Wright's Law before? Until sniffers were around, why encrypt? But that changed pretty quickly. Also, when everything costs like $650 for an Ethernet card, people are less likely to do research like, well, how do I make a sniffer? How can I actually look what's on the wire? As prices come down, though, people start investigating this sort of thing. DSNF came out in, whoa, I got that wrong. DSNF's much, much later than that. I believe DSNF was, I have it in my article in the correct version of it. I believe it was like 99. I should have put TCP dump. I think that's what I was meant to put there, not DSNF. SSH came out in 1995 to fix some of these problems as far as telnet's concerned, because now at least you're encrypting the data when you're trying to shell into a box. Yeah, DSNF came out in 1999. This was a sniffer that allowed you to actually extract just the password. TCP dump is a more full-featured sniffer where you see everything. DSNF just plucks out the passwords from the stream. And EPCAP came out in 2001, decoding other passwords as well. And despite the fact that these kind of tools existed, despite the fact that TCP dump existed when they were designing HTTP basic authentication, they decided to do something as simple as just take the username and the password, put it together, and base64 code it, which is reversible. No idea why they decided that was a good way of doing it. They later designed better systems like a digest. Into the late 90s, MD5 became a popular algorithm for storing of passwords. The problem with using this especially, though, is the problem is not so much they used MD5 as they used raw MD5, no hash, no multiple iterations. The reason they did this was because PHP had a crypt function. Unfortunately, it was not cross-platform compatible. So if you wrote code, the password file or the passwords that were stored would not be the same on the different platforms. MD5, however, was. Also, apparently, there was U.S. export restrictions on DES, so they couldn't necessarily, or at least in theory, maybe couldn't necessarily use that. So they decided to use MD5. But since they had no salt, it was causing problems. Also, apparently, there's ways of making MD5 collisions now, although my understanding when it comes to password usage, this is kind of irrelevant, because while you can create a collision, you're probably not going to be able to create a collision you can actually enter as a password. If you're doing things nowadays, though, you're probably better off using the more portable and public domain PHPass framework or PHP 5.5 Plus's password hash function instead. Also into the 90s, people started looking more and more into time memory trade-offs. Remember I talked about pre-computation attacks before? The reason you salt is you make it storage expensive to be able to compute all possible passwords. Because you have to compute all of them with this particular salt. You got to compute all of them with this next salt. You got to compute them all with this next salt. And you have no idea which value that hash is going to be. So it becomes basically impossible to store all possible passwords. When people really started putting this into use, I mean, the idea has been around for quite a while. Martin Hellman, back in 1980, proposed an idea like that. But Philippe Ochelin, and I'm pretty sure I'm butchering that name, in 2003 published a paper called Making a Faster Cryptographical Time Memory Trade-Off. And these popularized rainbow tables. And the rainbow table is kind of, I don't know how to explain it because I'm not really a data structures guy. But it's an even quicker way than just looking it up in a file. And he used rainbow tables to store a bunch of LM hashes. You can also do NTLM and be able to quickly find a password from just a hash. Because remember, Windows hashes, sorry, these are Windows hashes. Windows hashes are not salted. So it was feasible to actually store all these in a rainbow table. And the rainbow table also stores them more efficiently than you would if you just had them in a flat file. Oh, I have this in here because of a different talk I did. If you're ever curious what program and how it's storing a password, you know you enter the password, but you're not sure how it's storing it. What you can do is enter the password, find where it's writing to. Sometimes you use things like I'm trying to think, procmon to figure out where it's writing to. Pull that hash value out after using the password, and see if you can Google that up someplace, and maybe it'll give you an idea of what algorithm they're using. Of course, getting the source code helps. How good are you using a debugger? That's another way you can possibly find one. Another thing from the 90s that became popular was hash to hash. And I'm surprised this didn't come about longer. Because think about it, a lot of these things were originally designed in the early 90s, but until I guess more people had tools to experiment with, they didn't actually start messing with it. The way a challenge response works, the way a challenge response system works is you maybe negotiate how you're going to do a challenge response, and then you get a cryptographic nonce from the server. You do a mathematical operation with that with a shared secret. In this case, let's say the password. You send it back, and if the server sees, oh, well, he did the right mathematical operation, the same one I did, and it comes to the same value, so you must have the correct password. Now, in the case of Windows, this happens to be the hash. The secret is not actually your password, but it's your hash. Depending on how you're authenticating the system, there is some variability there. Like if you try to access the system via its IP, it's not going to use Kerberos. It's going to end up using like NTLM or LM challenge response. Now just NTLM because they disabled LM to my knowledge unless you turn it back on. So this wasn't really thought about having the hash as being your secret as being a problem until around 97 and BugTrack ID 233. This was attributed, or at least credited to Paul Ashton. He made a post on NT BugTrack and his modified Samba client, which allowed you to put in the password hash instead of a password to allow you to connect. I'm surprised no one came up with that beforehand. But even though he came up with this, it wasn't for quite a while before really usable tools came out for pen testers for this. Joe Moku released a Samba patch in 2003 that allow you to do this more easily. But it wasn't until 2007 a lot of people started doing pass the hash attack. And Metasploit added support for that via Kurt Goodmatcher in 2007. Then tools like, I'm not sure when in 2007 each one of these happened. I can't find the exact dates. If you can, email me. MSVCTL came out by Gumbel in 2007 as well. And these all allow you to like enter the hash instead of the password and basically become that user. And Pass the Hash Toolkit came out by Ochoa, I have no idea if that's pronounced right, in 2007. Here's basically how Pass the Hash would work. You negotiate what kind of authentication you want to do. You agree on a one to use. You send back the challenge, the nonce. You do a mathematical operation on it. In this case, you're using the password hash, and you send it back. But it's easy to get the password hash. Remember those SAM and system files I mentioned before? Let's say you crack one system. you grab that SAM and system file, or you dump the hashes straight out of memory. Now you have the hashes. Then you use these to authenticate to the system. The system doesn't really know if you actually have the right password. They just know that you have the right hash. So what happens is most people, well, a lot of corporations have imaged systems where all the systems are using the exact same password. There's no salt, so that exact same password is the same on all of them. The hash is the same on all of them anyway. That's irrelevant as opposed to the way these challenge protocols work. So you crack one system. You dump all its hashes. You can't crack the password, let's say, but you don't need to crack the password. You can take that particular hash and use it to crack other systems. And you can put sniffers on those boxes, dump all the hashes off those boxes, dump passwords off those boxes, and then keep spreading yourself through the network. The way we normally do this a lot of times on pen tests is we find one box that has a vulnerability, we crack it, we dump its local password hashes, we take that local password hash for, let's say, the admin user, try a whole bunch of other boxes throughout the network, see if they have the same local admin user, and then keep iterating. Oh, sorry, yes, they have the same local admin password, and just keep iterating. And as you're going through all these systems, you try to find some system out there that has a domain admin logged into it. Once you find a domain admin, you dump the actual password out of memory with Mimikatz and own the domain. We'll talk a little bit more about that hopefully in just a second. There's several different tools out there you can use for pass the hash. Metasploit's Interpreter has been supported for quite a while. Windows Credential Editor is also nice if you're only going to be using things. If you want to use any old Windows app, it allows you to actually type in the well, in this case, I'm showing how to generate a password. But let's assume you didn't know the password. You can use Windows CE-S, the username, the domain, and what the password hash is, and essentially you become that particular user on the domain. And that's a lot easier. I used to, when I'd find a domain credential, I'd make my machine part of the domain. But you can do this instead, and you're functioning as that particular domain user after using Windows Credential Editor. Also, in the late 2000s, and I'm not sorry, later on in the early 2000s, dumping passwords straight from memory became popular with Mimikatz. Apparently, plaintext passwords are stored in memory as part of inside the LSA service process memory to facilitate authentication systems like Digest and SSP. And a guy named Benjamin Delph, also known as GentleWiki on Twitter, he wrote Mimikatz in 2007 so he could experiment around with Windows authentication. And what it allows you to do is dump the plain text passwords out of memory. So if you get one local hash of some machine, let's say you can physically walk up to a machine, grab its hash, or you've cracked one machine on the network and gotten system-level privileges, you get those password hashes, you start looking around on other machines, eventually you find someone who's a domain admin and dump the password out of memory using Mimikatz. And this version of Mimikatz built into Metasploit, well, I should say, built into Interpreter, you can load it up and be able to dump plaintext passwords. Another thing of the late 90s that became popular was GPU cracking. A lot of people, 5 minutes? Okay. Let's see. Yeah, GPUs are maybe not as not as versatile as CPUs, but they're very good at doing mathematical calculations in parallel. And because more and more 3D games came out, people producing more and more powerful cards to process more polygons on the screen. So in some ways, I suppose you can actually credit Doom to how fast we can crack passwords now, because more people want these systems, and the more people that produce electronics, as more people produce that particular type of electronics, become cheaper and cheaper. But since you can do all this in parallel, people started building password cracking boxes that use video cards instead of the normal CPU for doing most of the password cracking. The first people I know of to do this is Elcomsoft with the distributed password recoverer. But eventually other tools came out. One of the most popular is OCL Hashcat or CUDA Hashcat. It depends on whether if it's your NVIDIA or AMD, if I remember correctly. And it would allow you to use multiple video cards to actually crack. They also added support for GPU cracking in John the Ripper with version 1.7.9 if you use the Jumbo 6 patch in 2012. That particular box you see right there is a password cracker that TrustedSec owns and runs. Now, I want to expand the article I wrote online, and it has more details than I have in this presentation. I'll have a link to it in a second. But for future ideas that I'd like to look more into, Honeywoods and honey tokens. It's an idea someone put forth in academia, where essentially you have bits of data that you put out there on your network that don't actually mean anything to you, but if you see them appear someplace else, it lets you in that someone has cracked your system. Gene Spafford and some other people came up with the idea of let me see, Ersatz or Ezerat. How do you pronounce Ezerat? Ersatz. Yes, Ersatz passwords. Essentially, the idea would be you'd have a way of making a system where the user's actual password would still function correctly and they could log in, but you'd also generate a bad password that would not log in but would warn you. So basically, they would add code to the system to where people could still log in, but if they tried to crack the password file, it would actually crack to the wrong thing, and if somebody ever tried to enter that password that was wrong, it would alert you that someone was trying to get in. And he's got a paper on that out at Purdue. Other things to like to look into for future is like hardware-dependent functions. So let's say you're using something about the system for doing the password hashing. The password hash on one box wouldn't be the same as a different box because of something about the hardware. Oh, right, our text version of this presentation is out on our blog. And like I said, I think I go into a lot more detail, and I actually do more references to where I found the information. A lot of the information I've pulled up comes from old group postings, so it was hard to find all the details. If I got anything wrong in the article, let me know. I'm trying to keep it up to date and keep expanding it. But that's it. A quick announcement about DerbyCon. You were asking about dates earlier. Apparently September 23rd to 27th. And that's it, pretty much it. Are there any questions? All right. Oh, yes. No, probably not, because it's so simple. I mean, it's you don't have to give them anything. It's something they know. Maybe, well, biometrics, maybe, sort of, but if hardware got a lot cheaper, but I don't see passwords ever going away totally, no. Anybody else? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks, everybody, for coming out for ShowMeCon. That concludes the conference. June 13th and June 14th of 2016. Hope to see you guys again. Thank you very much.